Chapter 1 The Legend.
Daniel was a watchmaker. He was in his 40s and single. His parents lived in London. He lived by the sea, in the southwest of England. He lived alone in a small house on a quiet street, in Penzance. Daniel was a tall thin man, but he was very strong. He had his own workshop. He fixed watches. He made his own high-quality watches. He often did other jobs as well. Daniel worked very long hours. He usually worked late. His workshop was near Eastern Green Beach. At the end of the day, he often went to the beach to stretch his legs. One night, Daniel met an old friend on his walk. Her name was Susan. "Daniel, how are you?" she said. "Hi, Susan. What are you doing here?" "I'm walking, just like you." Susan laughed. "I see. Well, let's walk together then." Daniel and Susan walked for a long time. They talked about many things. They talked about their jobs and their families. They talked about everything in general. As they walked, Susan asked, "How's your job? Are you working a lot?" "Yes, I have a lot of work. I'm very happy." "Good for you, Daniel." Susan was a security guard. She watched the boats near the beach. She told Daniel she liked her job. She saw many interesting things on the beach. In fact, she had found something just today. "Daniel," began Susan, "I was actually hoping to see you." "Really?" replied Daniel. "Yes, I found something, and I don't know what to do with it." "What have you found, Susan?" Susan took out a watch. It looked very old. It was very good quality. "Can you tell me what kind of watch this is?" she asked. "Let me have a look," Daniel said. Daniel took the watch in his hand. He looked at it closely. "I have no idea what kind it is," he said at last. Susan was surprised. "Don't you know anything about it?" "Well, I know it's a watch, but it's very old. I'm just not sure." He paused and looked at her. "Do you have to go to work right now, Susan?" "No. I'm finished for the day." "Let's go to my workshop. I have some books that might help us." Daniel and Susan went to Daniel's workshop. The workshop was very old. Inside the workshop there were many tools and watches. It was all part of Daniel's job. Susan had never been to the workshop. She thought it was very interesting. "Wow," she said. "There's a lot of stuff in here." "Yes, I have a lot of work. I like what I do." "That's good, Daniel." Daniel told Susan to follow him. She put down the watch and walked into another room. There were a lot of books. They were very large and very old. It was impossible to read many of the names. "What are we doing here?" Susan asked. "We're looking for information," answered Daniel. "Information about what?" "About what kind of watch this is. I've never seen anything like it before." Daniel and Susan searched the books. After several minutes, Susan found something. It was in a book about the Caribbean Sea. "Daniel, look at this," she called. Daniel closed his book and went to Susan. "What is it?" "It's a picture of the watch, and it's in a book about pirates." Daniel was very surprised. A book about pirates? Why would a pirate book have a picture of the watch? It didn't make sense. Susan explained. "The name of the book is Caribbean Pirates. It's about England and fighting pirates in the Caribbean Sea." "I still don't understand. What about the watch?" Listen, said Susan, according to the book, there was a famous pirate. His name was Eric L. Kraken. He had a very particular type of watch. They say it had strange powers. Strange powers? What kind of strange powers? Asked Daniel. People said that L. Kraken could travel through time. Susan turned the page and continued. It says that the watch helped him time travel. Daniel laughed and said, that's just a legend. A pirate who traveled through time, and with a watch. That can't be true. Daniel laughed. Just then, there was a noise in the workshop. What was that? Asked Daniel. I don't know, replied Susan. Let's go and see. The two friends went back into the workshop. They looked around. The watch was gone. Somebody has stolen the watch, Daniel cried. See? That watch is special. It's not a normal watch, said Susan. Then Daniel noticed something else. The door to the workshop was open. Suddenly, he heard footsteps outside. Somebody was running down the street. Daniel looked at Susan and started to run. Let's go, he called back. Daniel and Susan ran out of the workshop. They went towards the beach. When they reached it, Daniel looked down. There were footprints in the sand. Very deep and large footprints, like those of a very stout man. Suddenly, Susan stopped. She pointed to a large man in black. He was running down the beach. Look, Daniel, there he is, she shouted. Daniel ran after the man and shouted, Hey, stop, stop right now. The man ignored him and kept running. Again Daniel demanded, Stop, stop right now. The man continued to ignore Daniel, so Daniel ran even faster. At last he caught up with the man. Daniel pushed him and they both fell over onto the sand. The man shouted loudly, You shall let me go. I have done nothing to you. This is my watch. Daniel stood up. He took a moment to look at the man. He was quite a character. His clothes were not modern. They were very old-fashioned. They were in a style worn hundreds of years ago. He also had a strange hairstyle. It was one from long ago. Daniel and Susan watched the man. He slowly got up. He cleaned the sand from his clothes. He had the watch in his right hand. He looked at them suspiciously. What do you want? Why are you looking at me like that? He demanded. The stout man spoke with a very unusual accent. His English sounded very strange. Daniel looked at him and said, You stole my watch. You came into my workshop and took it. No, said the stout man. You stole it from me. I have only taken it back. It is mine. Daniel and Susan looked at each other. Finally, Susan asked the stout man, Who are you? I'm Eric L. Kraken. Now, please excuse me. I must go back to the 17th century.
Chapter 2, The Caribbean.
Daniel and Susan looked at the strange man in front of them. Finally, Daniel managed to speak. The 17th century go back, you mean? You're really Eric L. Kraken, he asked. The man said nothing. He was attempting to use the watch. Daniel moved closer. The man looked like an old pirate. He wore old black clothes. Clothes like a pirate from the Caribbean. A pirate, like those characters in legends and books. Can it be true? Asked Daniel. Finally, the man looked at him and answered, Yes, that's me. Now Daniel understood. The watch really did have strange powers. So the legend is true, he said. What legend? Asked Eric. The legend about your watch. Eric looked at Daniel and Susan. How do you know about my watch? He said. Susan answered, It's written as a legend in our book. In a book, you say? Eric said with a smile. Ha! So I am famous. Good. No. Not you exactly. Just your watch. Eric walked across the beach. He was thinking. He looked at his watch and said, The watch is mine. But I didn't buy it. I found it. I took it from another pirate. Another pirate, said Daniel. Yes, a dead pirate. Eric laughed. Then he became serious. I don't know who he was. No one does. But I got this. It is mine. He started playing with the watch again. Daniel watched Eric. He was attempting to use the watch. But it wasn't working. Then Daniel realized something. Eric L. Kraken had only found the watch. He didn't know how it worked. Eric didn't know why the watch had such strange powers either. Daniel looked at the pirate and said, Eric, do you know how the watch works? Of course I do, Eric shouted. Then he looked at Daniel again. All right, he said. I don't know how it works. I think there are different factors involved. Sometimes, I hold it in my hand and it takes me forward in time. Like it did here. Then, exactly 7 hours later, I hold it in my hand again and I return to my time. I don't know what factors start and stop it. Eric paused. But why do you do it? I like to see how things have changed. There are no more pirates. There are just tall buildings everywhere. And did you know there are now flying machines? Unbelievable. Daniel and Susan smiled. It seemed a little crazy. Eric didn't know much about the current world. Eric looked at the watch again. Then he turned away and shouted, Now leave me alone. It's almost time. 6 hours and 58 minutes. Soon, I can return to my time and place. And I can't be late. Daniel and Susan looked at each other. What do you think? Susan asked Daniel quietly. What are you asking? Do you want to go to the 17th century Caribbean? Susan thought. Come on. It will be fun. Said Daniel. Don't pressure me. Susan thought a moment more. Finally she said, Okay. Let's go. Daniel and Susan approached Eric L. Kraken and said, We want to go with you. No, said Eric. What do you mean no? Demanded Daniel. I mean. No, said Eric. He simply looked at Daniel. But we want to see how things have changed, too. We know the modern world. We want to see how things were. Like you want to see how things will be. Suddenly, Eric got a strange look in his eyes. It was like he had an idea. Oh wait. You know the modern world, he paused. Okay. You come with me. I may have a task for you. Okay. Okay. Replied Daniel. So, do we all just touch the watch? Yes. Just put your hands on the watch. Get in position. Hurry. Susan, Daniel, and Eric all touched the watch. Suddenly they were transported to the Caribbean in the 17th century. The night turned to day and they were in a pirate camp. The process was surprisingly easy. Daniel and Susan released the watch. Several pirates were looking at them. One of them was a fit man with dark skin and long hair. He approached Eric L. Kraken. Good morning, Captain. You're finally back. Then he looked at Daniel and Susan and added, and you've brought guests. Eric smiled. Yes, Frank. I did, he answered. Then he turned to the other. Pirates. Listen up. He shouted. These people here are. Eric L. Kraken paused. He looked at his guests and asked, what are your names? Daniel and Susan, they answered. That's right? Men. These people are Daniel and Susan. The pirates didn't pay much attention. Crazy things had often occurred due to the watch. Yes, Daniel and Susan, Eric continued with a strange smile. And they are going to help us. They will help us win today. This got the attention of the men. The pirates shouted happily. Win, said Daniel. Win what? Eric turned to Daniel and Susan. Then he turned back to his men. You're going to help us win the battle, Daniel and, Susan. Battle, cried Susan. What battle? The one against the English ships. What, you didn't say anything about that? She replied. Eric L. Kraken simply ignored them. Back to work. He called to his men. Then he and the pirate called Frank went to his tent. Daniel and Susan were left alone. Daniel and Susan stood and looked at the sea. It was filled with pirate ships. A moment later, Frank returned. I am sorry, he said. What, why are you sorry? Susan asked. Because Eric is crazy. Susan and Daniel looked at each other. Crazy? Asked Daniel. Crazy, Frank paused and looked at them. Completely. I see, replied Daniel. And why do you say that? Because he thinks he can use you. Use us. To stop the English ships. The English know about the watch. Their aim is to get it at any price. They attack us every night. Eric must stop them. He claims you can help. There were battle noises far away. The first ships were under attack. The English were coming. How does Kraken want us to help? Asked Daniel. He claims you two know what will happen. You live in the future. No, no, no. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know anything about this battle. We only know about the watch. And even that's just a legend. Frank looked down. Eric will be disappointed. He will do anything to keep that watch. If you can't help him, he won't need you anymore. He gave them a serious look. Things might get ugly. Susan and Daniel looked at each other in fear. What can we do? Asked Susan. You have to steal the watch, explained Frank. If the captain doesn't have the watch, there won't be a fight? Okay. When? This afternoon there'll be an important battle. Captain L. Kraken is going to bring a lot of ships to the fight. You must take the watch from him. Then go back to your time and never return. Frank returned to Eric's tent. Daniel and Susan sat on the beach. What can we do? I'm just a watchmaker. You're a security guard, said Daniel. How can we steal from a pirate? We have to find a way, replied Susan. Wait. I have an idea.
Chapter 3, The Battle. A few hours later, everyone was ready for battle. Eric, Frank, Daniel, and Susan boarded Eric L. Kraken's ship. It was very big. It had many cannons. It was the pirate's personal and favorite ship. Frank was his second in command. L. Kraken always traveled with him. Eric L. Kraken was high up at the helm. Frank showed Daniel and Susan the rest of the ship. What do you think of our beauty? He asked. Susan looked around and smiled. I can't believe I'm on a real pirate ship. This is incredible, she said. Frank laughed. It's nothing, he said. We see it daily. Frank brought Daniel and Susan back to the helm. The ship was already moving. The wind was slightly cold. But there were no clouds. All they could see was the blue water of the Caribbean and the beach. It was beautiful. Then Daniel remembered they were going into battle against the English. They had to do something to stop it. Eric L. Kraken watched the sea. He was still at the helm. Daniel and Susan watched Eric. Suddenly, they heard Frank's voice behind them. So, how are you going to do it? Do what? Replied Daniel. Steal the watch. You have to do it before the battle starts. Wait a second, said Daniel. That's the part one don't understand. Why does Eric want Susan and me here on the ship? We don't know how to fight. I told you. He thinks you can beat the English somehow. Daniel looked up. He saw Eric. He was looking at them. His eyes showed nothing. He was just watching them. Well, he is wrong, said Daniel. We can't help. I don't know what he thinks we can do. Actually, Frank said. I don't know what Eric is thinking either. Why do you say that? Asked Susan. Look at the sea. Daniel and Susan looked. They counted 10 pirate ships. See? We have 10 ships, Frank pointed out. Susan didn't understand what Frank meant. Yes, we have 10 ships. So? Frank just looked at her. Oh, I see, she said. We have 10 ships, but the English have more, right? Yes, how many more? They have 30. 30, shouted Daniel. And we have 10? You're all crazy. That's why I want to stop this. You have to steal the watch. We can't win this battle. But El Kraken won't give up. Not to the English. Not to anyone. Okay. So what can we do? Asked Daniel. We steal the watch. Susan jumped in. She looked at Daniel. Like I said, I have an idea. Susan explained the plan. You're a watchmaker. Right? Yes, answered Daniel. Tell Eric that you can win the battle. But you need his watch to do it. And how do I do that? Tell him you know how it works. Say you can stop the English ships with its powers. And then? Run. That's a really bad plan, said Daniel. But it's the only one we have, replied Susan. Daniel agreed. They had no choice. Daniel walked over to Eric. Time was running out. The captain was telling his men what to do. Eric saw Daniel. What do you want? You know a way to win? Yes. Yes, I do. Come here. I'll tell you. The stout pirate and Daniel walked away from the others. Frank and Susan pretended that they didn't see anything. Eric, as you know, I'm a watchmaker. I need to see your watch. The pirate's face changed completely. What for? If you let me see it. I think we can win the battle. What do you mean? Asked Eric. He was looking at Daniel suspiciously. Daniel didn't know what to say. He thought hard. Then he continued. I think I know how it works, he lied. So? If you let me see it. I can change it. I can change the watch. It will take us to another place. One that is far from here. That way we don't need to fight. The time had come. The English ships had arrived. They began firing their cannons. The pirate boats fired their cannons back. The ships rocked as the cannon balls hit around them. Eric shouted at his men, "Come on. Keep firing. We can't lose." Daniel tried to think. He needed the watch. As long as Eric had the watch, he would fight. And without the watch, Daniel and Susan couldn't return to Penzance. "Listen to me," shouted Daniel. Eric ignored him. The English ships' cannons kept firing. "Let me see it," continued Daniel. "Let me see the watch," he shouted. "Then we can win the battle. We can beat the English." Eric looked at him. But he held tightly onto the watch. Suddenly, a cannon shot through the helm. Eric lost his balance. He fell. This was Daniel's chance. He grabbed the watch from Eric and ran. Eric realized what had happened. "Stop. Stop that man," he shouted. Eric's men began to chase Daniel. Daniel threw the watch to Susan. She quickly caught it and ran. Daniel ran towards her. Then they saw Eric. He was coming their way. The English cannons fired again. Eric tried to grab Susan. Suddenly, Frank stepped in to stop Eric. He was helping Susan. Susan had the watch. Daniel grabbed for the watch. Eric grabbed for the watch. Frank grabbed Susan to keep her safe. The next thing they knew, the watch was activated. The whole group was traveling forward in time. They were going to the 21st century. Day turned to night and they were back on Eastern Green Beach. Eric was the first to realize what had happened. He looked around for the watch. He couldn't see it anywhere. Then Eric saw it. It was under Frank's foot. He pushed Frank away. He picked up the watch. It was broken. "What have you done, Frank? What have you done?" Eric cried. Frank ignored him. He was looking at the beach. Then he looked at the town and the people. It was the first time he had been in the future. It was all new, and a little strange. Eric got more and more angry. He said to Frank, "What do we do now? We can't go back. What do we do?" Nobody said anything. Finally, Susan spoke. "Come to the workshop, Eric. Daniel will try to fix your watch. And if he can fix it, you can get home. But then you must destroy the watch. It is dangerous. No good will come from it." "I will," replied Eric. Then Susan looked at Frank. "I have a request. You must promise to help Eric. He must destroy the watch. Make sure he does not keep it. Force him to do it if you have to. If you do not destroy it, it will be the end of you. Do you understand?" "I do," said Frank. "When I am back home, I never want to see that watch again." Finally Susan looked at Daniel. "And you," she said smiling. "The next time you have a crazy idea, like wanting to time travel, don't take me with you." Daniel smiled and agreed.